Hello, everyone. I hope the audio is doing good. It's a bit of a hot day, so I have the fan going in the house here, but I should sound pretty okay. Everyone, welcome to Sasquatch Out of the Shadows. This is, of course, number 62 of the live stream, and it's cool to see a nice turnout here. Actually, it says we have 13 viewers now. Yeah, pretty good for a starting period there. So, of course, as always, kind of just introducing what the topic is and all of that. So, first off, of course, this is Alexander's live stream, but he's actually off in California right now helping film for something and will not be back until I think the 19th or so. So, there actually isn't a planned stream for the next 2 weeks either. Alexander's offered to let me host one of those as well, two of them if I can, but I probably can't manage both of those. So one of them will probably have to suffice for that. If anyone would like to see that, please let me know. And so that's the plan for the future live streams right now. I believe he comes back the night that there would be the second outgoing one, so he won't be. He might just miss that. But yes, so again, welcome to Sasquatch Out of the Shadows. This is always a great show to be on because it's so. Alexander has done a great job, I think, of not just getting some just really class act guests on, but also getting to a point where the topics that are discussed, they expand out from Sasquatch, not just in terms of covering other cryptids sometimes, but also covering, just a vast array of factors that feed into the case of Sasquatch. So, I think that's kind of how I'd like to introduce the presentation that I'm going to be doing today. I'm Karac St. Laurent, for everyone who doesn't know. I run the Crash Course Cryptozoology channel on YouTube, which has become a documentary company as well recently. And the things that I produce often try to be as informational as possible, as educational, I should say. And that is a continuing theme for tonight's show, because the presentation that I'll be giving is called The Many Faces of Sasquatch. And if I can just pull up my screen right here, I believe we should be able to see the full screen of this right here. Let me know if the full screen of this can be seen. I'll check the chat very quickly here just to make sure that it can. Could everyone see that properly? I understand that sometimes with StreamYard, full screen is a bit faulty. So hopefully that worked rather well. And the audio, I'm assuming, is fine. No one's complained about the audio just yet, so that's good. There's no audio infiltration, let's say, from the fan then. I see no one complaining about full screen yet, so hopefully that means all is well. Nice to see, just some... It's always nice to see returning people here. Patrick McGuire right here. Sandra, very, very lovely person who's always on here. Okay, good. Thank you, Paroli, and Kevin Hamilton, of course. Thank you very much, everyone, for letting me know everything's working well. All right, so of course, this is a format where it's sectioned, similar to the last presentation that I conducted on the channel here. And after each section, I'll obviously take any questions. I'd like to interact as much as possible. So without further ado, just look at all of this. Brian, should we go hiking? Hello, everyone. Hope all is all well with you as well. Good evening from Northeast Illinois. Very interesting place for Sasquatch reports. Bill Mers, hello. All right, yeah, a lot of really awesome people. 26 people now. That's really great. So here we have the presentation. The Many Faces of Sasquatch, and essentially what this presentation is going to attempt to do is, well, I'd like to start off by saying that I wouldn't like to argue for anything in this presentation, actually. It's a presentation that's full... It's actually constituted, I would even say, of differing opinions. It's a presentation on the many ideas surrounding the identity of the Sasquatch, if such a species does exist. And for the most part, this presentation does take a zoological angle. We are under the assumption for this presentation that this is a species and not something beyond understanding as we currently know it. Now, of course, I say most of the presentation because I would like to cover that other end of it very briefly, but for the sake of the presentation, most of this is zoological in nature. So essentially, we'll be looking into the fossil record for species that people have very popularly proposed could be likely candidates for the Sasquatch, for the modern Sasquatch. And, that involves a lot of needing to understand certain scientific terms, but that's already formatted into the presentation. So without further ado, I'll stop my blabbering here and move on into the presentation itself. The Many Faces of Sasquatch. So really, what is all this? Well, like I mentioned, we're assuming a zoological angle here. And the mystery at hand is, well, we have this animal that's being seen, and it's a quite strange animal because if it exists, it's the closest animal that we've ever seen to a person. It's a really close animal. And we have this, what would you say, amassing amount of evolutionary knowledge on how species develop and how they interact in the ecosystem. And I think ultimately, this is kind of the crux of the issue, right? If it exists, if it is zoological and it exists, it must have a fossil record. Do we have anything in the fossil record that could help explain this? That's essentially the question being asked. And when we look to the animal kingdom, we have two groups that could help explain this. Hominids and the hominins. Now, this is a term, I should say these two are terms that really are... There's a lot of people who don't fully understand the parameters of the definitions of these terms. And really, I don't blame anybody for that, because it's kind of difficult, especially with how similar not only the names, but the concepts are. So before I get exactly into the definition, one thing to help people who might be confused with this classification system is to remember the following. All of the hominids, the animals in the group hominid, are also in the group hominin. Oh, no, my bad. See, there, I've messed it up because of the language now. All of the animals in the group hominin are also in the group hominid, but not all of the animals in the group hominid are hominin. And the reason for this is because the definition of hominid, essentially, is an animal is a hominid if it is a modern human, a human ancestor, or one of the African great apes. Whereas hominin is the same thing as hominid, but excluding the African great apes. That also includes the orangutan, by the way, in the great apes, which actually isn't an African great ape, it's an Asian great ape. But hominin also occasionally, just to clarify, does include the genus Pan, which is just bonobos and chimpanzees as far as we know. That's highly debated, obviously. So for the sake of this presentation, we'll assume that hominin only includes the humans that we know today and ancient humans, whereas hominid expands into the African and technically Asian great apes. So that is the first set of definitions to really understand going into debating where Sasquatch lies. Because, of course, what this breaks down into is, are we dealing with a non-human primate or a human primate? Are we dealing with something that would be given to hominid or something that would be exclusively in hominin? So here's a small chart here to kind of help illustrate this, of the evolution of hominids and hominin. So, evolution is interesting this way because evolution is often looked at, with this famous chart of the monkey becoming the human at the end, is often looked at as linear. Oh yes, we came from monkeys. And in that sense, some people might even mistranslate that into humans are kind of the body plan that is the end goal for evolution. And really, that's just a very small bit of what evolution actually looks like. Evolution is a system of completely, for the most part at least, completely accidental mutations. Now, well, it is accidental. It's just interesting how accidents turn out sometimes. For instance, let's say butterfly camouflage as an adaptation makes perfect sense. As a mutation, it's obviously a bit strange because it's symmetrical and it looks just like an owl eye on both sides. That's interesting as a mutation. But essentially what evolution is a series of mutations. And what happens is let's say you have two mutations. You have a mutation in one chimp and a mutation in the other. And let's say, just by chance, one of those mutations is actually good for the chimp in specifically that chimp's environment, whereas the other one's not so good. It's a debilitating one. The chimp with the debilitating mutation will probably not be able to reproduce just because it's not going to be successful at surviving, and so passing down its genes isn't really something that is likely to happen. Whereas the chimpanzee that has the, let's say, adaptive mutation is something that will probably survive to pass down its genes, and if it's lucky enough, its offspring will get that same mutation and be able to survive as equally well. So we're seeing that take place in this diagram. What we're seeing is a series of mutations that led to different variations of what was at one point a common genetic ancestor. So, you have a few of the ones we'll be talking about here, actually. You have chimps and bonobos, but you also have, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, you have Paranthropus. And each of these skulls are obviously outlined with definitions here: massive cheek, teeth, and jaws for Paranthropus, and a bit of Homo habilis ancestors, obviously. So, there's a lot of things that go into evolution. It's not linear. It's a kind of a complicated bush, in a way, that consists not of changes that led to other species, but changes that were successful in leading to other species. So that's interesting to clarify, I would say. Just making sure that everyone is still being able to. Yes, I did hear about the Dragon Man skull. There's some debate right now. I'll actually pull up that question really quick because that's a good one, I think. There's some debate right now over whether or not that is a new species. A lot of people obviously are talking about Denisovans with just how robust and big the skull is. But, it's hard to confirm that from a relatively small fossil record that we have for Denisovans. But yeah, the Dragon Man is really interesting. It hasn't been proposed as Sasquatch just yet. But, it's going to be an interesting thing to talk about when we get to nearing the end of the presentation, actually. So we'll just, we'll hop back into there really quick. Ryan from Worship Through a Scream just jumped in. Hello, Ryan. Glad you made it tonight, man. All right, let's go back here. All right, so yep, here's a small, obviously, graphic on evolution and looking a bit at hominid and hominin evolution. Hominid evolution breaks off right around here or so, hominids being the chimpanzees, bonobos, and other great apes. And down here we have all of these being human ancestors and eventually things that are more modern human-esque. So that brings us, speaking of all of these, these winding points on this branch, to the points on the branch that we'll be discussing in the presentation for, we'll call them candidates for what the Sasquatch might be if the Sasquatch exists. These are all the ones that we're going over. So the unknown ape hypothesis, which is kind of a loose one, it's essentially saying, well, it's a new kind of primate that might have origins in known species, and we'll talk about that briefly. The Gigantopithecus theory, obviously. Dryopithecus, which is another type of extinct ape. And then we have Paranthropus and the Australopithecines, which are ape-like human ancestors that evolved in Africa quite some time ago. Neanderthals, which are obviously one of the closest species to modern humans that ever existed towards the whittling down, let's say, of the human species. And two that are going to be quite interesting: the Primate Hybrid species, which is kind of not complicated, but a bit abstract. So we'll talk about that soon. And uncategorizable, which is kind of where we get into beyond zoological territory. And of course, here's our classifications. These are all the hominid candidates. These are all the ones that we could classify as non-human, essentially. The unknown ape hypothesis, Giganto, Dryo, and Primate Hybrid, whereas the hominin candidates are restricted in this to just Paranthropus and the Australopithecines and Neanderthals. I shouldn't say restricted because, Australopithecines cover quite a wide range of human ancestors, but we'll whittle it down to specific species just for the sake of simplicity, essentially, because if we didn't, we'd be here for possibly days on end. So we will start off here with the hominids. So the first question might be, why would we consider hominids? Why not just consider the hominin? And the answer for that is, one of them is because it can be hard to tell the difference at some points between what is a hominid and what is a hominin. Essentially, though, we're considering hominid for the Sasquatch because there's a great amount of behavioral similarities to great apes. And if you'd like to know more about that, I would definitely suggest checking out the work of John Bindernagel. Anatomical features that are nearly exclusively found in great apes, the African great apes especially, are found in many Sasquatch reports. And debatably, a lack of tool usage. We'll take fringe encounters into account, and we'll say, debatably, we'll say a lack of tool usage, but not a total lack. In fact, you could even debate what tool usage counts as if something is wood knocking or rock clacking, etc., etc. So that moves us on into our first hominid candidate for Sasquatch. This is probably the second, if not most popular theory for the Sasquatch, the Gigantopithecus/Gigantopithecus descendant theory. And of course, first, an introduction into Gigantopithecus would be appropriate for that. So Gigantopithecus is this prehistoric ape. It's the largest ape that we currently know of having existed ever. It's a southeast, I believe, or eastern, I should say, great ape, discovered in China in 1935 by a Dutch paleontologist named Ralph von Koenigswald. So the whole story is kind of classic, but it's really interesting. Koenigswald had traveled to China and was looking in an apothecary when he found fossilized molars that looked like primate molars, but they were enormous. And it turned out that the apothecary and many other apothecaries across China and other areas of Asia had been finding fossils of Gigantopithecus and taking the teeth and mandibles and grinding them up for medicinal purposes. They actually called them dragon's teeth. So he was able to take a sample of the molars and identified an entirely new species in 1935 that he called Gigantopithecus blacki. Blacki named after, I think, a late anthropologist friend of his or a mentor, something along those lines. And we had subsequent specimens uncovered in 1955, 56, 57, and 1963. Unfortunately, we've yet to find some really, really detailed fossils. We have essentially molars and mandible fragments that have luckily been able to make a full mandible out of. We've been able to do that, but it's hard to know exactly what the face looked like, exactly what the orientation of the anatomy was. The mandibles really are kind of our best piece. In fact, it's so kind of contested with the little fossil record that we have that there's been some, we'll say, debate about multiple subspecies to Gigantopithecus blacki. So I believe currently the species that we recognize for Gigantopithecus are blacki and Gigantopithecus giganteus, which has also become kind of synonymous with a proposed third subspecies known as Gigantopithecus bilaspirensis. It's hard to tell. We know for a fact that this creature, this species, was living between 1 million to 125,000 years ago. So, very, very wide range of time there. So when talking, about the potential for subspecies, it would almost be shocking if there weren't subspecies of Gigantopithecus. These were creatures that were mostly vegetarian. They probably fed on bamboo and bamboo-like plants because the molars indicate that quite clearly. And for all we know, we're probably much like gorillas or orangutans in the sense that they were, for the most part, gentle giants. And giants they were. They were very, very large. And this is when Grover Krantz steps into the picture. Grover Krantz, I'm sure many of you know this name, was an anthropologist at the University of, I believe, Minnesota, but please correct me if I'm wrong. And he was essentially his time period's Jeff Meldrum, or his time period's John Bindernagel, in the sense that he was one of the only truly credentialed and borderline mainstream scientists to take Sasquatch seriously. He was very involved, and actually here what he's pictured with is a model he's built using the mandible of Gigantopithecus of what he believed the Gigantopithecus skull looked like. And he proposed the Gigantopithecus theory pretty much first for the Sasquatch. And he was so interesting that way because he was such a credited person that the fact that he factored Bigfoot into making the skull seems almost negligible, but perhaps it shouldn't be because he was so adamant about this that perhaps he forewent details when making the skull. But we're not here to debate that necessarily. We're here to just kind of state what his opinions were. He also posited that Gigantopithecus may have been bipedal, and I believe this was heavily influenced by the Sasquatch theory, but also by several other ideas that were floating around at the time, and we'll get to that in a moment. He was so convinced by this, by the idea that Gigantopithecus had crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America at some point and evolved into the Sasquatch, that he actually proposed a species name for it. He wanted to call it Gigantopithecus canadensis, and I believe he actually went to a Canadian government board to propose this. This is our scientific Canadian board. Unfortunately, of course, it was rejected. Unfortunately for him, I should say. Now, the idea of Gigantopithecus canadensis, we've kind of outlined it already, is that Gigantopithecus either was or became bipedal at some point, that these are the lineage of Gigantopithecus, that the Sasquatch is the lineage of Gigantopithecus, and in sense is Gigantopithecus, simply an offshoot of the same species, that it crossed the Bering Land Bridge, which was opened several thousand years ago and is the main reason that we have humans on the continent. It is the reason, essentially, unless you look into alternate theories, which some exist, but the most solid one is definitely the Bering Land Bridge. It's the most, we'll say, confirmable one. Based on the teeth, he believes that these things were omnivores. And, looking at things like the Patterson-Gimlin film, Grover Krantz noted that there were several features that were, at the time at least, perceived to be specifically hominid. One thing that Grover Krantz noted was the highness of the shoulders on the Patterson-Gimlin subject were part of maybe why the subject had to turn its whole torso to face Patterson and Gimlin. This is actually outlined in, it's not the episode, but it's a documentary called In Search of Bigfoot. And it's narrated by Leonard Nimoy. It's longer than an In Search of episode. For any of you who know In Search of, that was an old mystery, cryptozoology, paranormal series that Leonard Nimoy hosted back in the 1960s and 1970s, I believe. And in a feature length that Ancient Mysteries In Search of Bigfoot, one of the ideas that Grover Krantz on camera proposed was that it was similar in build to the gorilla, because gorillas often have to turn their bodies to look as well because their heads are so low on their shoulders that to turn, their chin actually runs into their shoulders. So they either have to tilt their head very far back or they have to turn their whole torso. And of course, there's countless pictures of gorillas turning their heads back like that. So that definitely is true. And of course, the size comparison between the Sasquatch and the Gigantopithecus is pretty, what would you say? Similar. There are very similar proportions if we're going off of reports. Here's where Gigantopithecus begins to get a bit muddy. We mentioned before that there is kind of this multiple subspecies. What are we looking at when we look at the line between hominids and hominin? And that was a large debate for a very long time. So, for instance, a German anthropologist, Franz Weidenreich, in 1946 proposed that we actually call the group that Gigantopithecus belonged to Gigantanthropus, because he believed it was actually a species of human, a very ape-like human, but a human nonetheless. There were also similarities that were pointed out by another anthropologist, Robert Broom, in 1939, to the teeth of Australopithecines, which we knew for a fact were not only humans, but were bipeds. So, walking on two legs, which is a big debate whether or not Gigantopithecus was quadrupedal or bipedal. There's been some work done on that, and we'll get to that in a moment here. And then, of course, there's connections to other ape-like human ancestors that are very close to apes, such as Meganthropus, which actually Koenigswald himself posited. Eventually, though, what it came down to was the out of Africa versus out of Asia problem. So at this point in time, we still were a bit unsure, and I would suggest that perhaps to some extent we still are, that we knew where humans geographically originated. There was a massive debate at the time between Africa and Asia. And because of the fact that we were not sure between specifically these two continents, many people, like Weidenreich, essentially posited, well, if humans came out of Asia, and this thing is so similar to Australopithecines and Meganthropus, then we should classify it as a human. And essentially at the time, this is what a lot of people were thinking Gigantopithecus looked like. Biped was a very popular option for Gigantopithecus at that point in time. And essentially, of course, when you look at this, the first thing you think is that's a Sasquatch. That's, up and down, that is what a Bigfoot looks like. So, we have a large creature. We don't know exactly what it is, but as time progresses, we kind of get a better idea. So, even this diagram says here, comparing it standing to a human, Gigantopithecus likely spent more time in a quadrupedal stance on all fours. There's a lot of factors that play into how exactly we've come to understand that. The first notion that was the case was the orientation and the size of the mandible. We were very hard pressed to find anything in the fossil record that had that robust of a mandible at that size and could lift it with its neck. It was often just, it didn't happen. So, at least not for a thing to be bipedal 24/7. So it was proposed that it actually would have had to let its jaw kind of, slouch forward and hold itself up with its knuckles or its arms in order to locomote, which of course would suggest a quadrupedal stance. And in 2019, we get some pretty good confirmation of this kind of idea. In 2019, peptide sequencing of dentine and enamel proteins of Gigantopithecus molars from Scheifing Cave indicates that Gigantopithecus was indeed closely allied with orangutans. So essentially what happened is proteins in enamel were taken out of Gigantopithecus molars, analyzed, and we found that they were exceedingly similar to what we find in orangutans. So not just the diet was similar, but also the actual makeup of the anatomical bones was similar to orangutans. And it continues, and assuming the current mutation rate in orangutans has remained constant, shared a common ancestor about 12 to 10 million years ago in the middle to late Miocene period. Their last common ancestor would have been a part of the Miocene radiation of apes. The same study calculated a divergence time between the Ponganae and African great apes about 26 to 17.7 million years ago. To clarify, Ponganae involves several lesser and greater apes, and it also involves orangutans. So while they're great apes, they are separate from the African great apes, although they're both considered hominid. So essentially what's being said here is, well, we're able to study some of the makeup on a deeper physical level than just anatomical of the Gigantopithecus, and we're finding that it's much closer to Ponganae than anything else. So the notions of a quadrupedal ape-like non-human Gigantopithecus were essentially, they're leaning pretty heavily that direction. So instead of seeing something like this, it's much more likely that what Gigantopithecus looked like was something like this. This is a fantastic representation made by, I think his name is Ramon Lopez, and this is with Quagga Wildlife Art. So if you'd like to check out that website and check out the artist, please do. He's absolutely fantastic, as you can tell. I mean, just so lifelike. And really, this is essentially, from a not full body perspective, unfortunately, it was a very, very large orangutan-like ape. Probably walked on all fours, probably lived very similar to the orangutan, especially in terms of sexual dimorphism, because we do see that we do posit sometimes that female teeth seem much smaller than male teeth. Again, there's some debate about what exactly that means. It could be female versus male, or it could be subspecies, of course. So essentially, we're looking at a creature like this. It's very non-Bigfoot-like, obviously, and even standing upright, it has resemblances, but about as much as a gorilla does standing upright, which granted is a lot of resemblances. And, even talking about Patty, we see some of the, some similar creases in the body and such. But this isn't to say, of course, none of this is to say that these are not potential candidates still. It's an analysis exactly of how likely each one to be. And really, there's kind of a point being made in here as well that we'll get to later. Essentially, the point being, and we'll expand on this, that all of these candidates share some qualities, but really kind of do fall short on many others. So before we go into our second one here, I'll definitely... Oh my gosh! That is all my fault. I am so sorry. I had no idea I was not sharing that. So let's go back and let's look through a bit of what we missed then. I am very sorry about that. So of course here we're talking about why we would do hominids. Here's our overview of Gigantopithecus and the way it was found by Ralph von Koenigswald in a Chinese apothecary, and how he discovered that there were actually a system of apothecaries essentially that were carrying these teeth and grinding them up. Here we have dates for the discoveries of several different specimens, mostly consisting of molars and parts of mandibles. We've actually been able to build a full mandible, again, based off of those. We have the proposition of multiple subspecies, even though that's kind of debated. We accept 2 currently, and even that's a bit shaky. And of course, we have our time span for how long ago these things existed. And here's talking about Grover Krantz. I'm actually glad we can go over this again, because I forgot a point about Grover Krantz that really is... let me just check to see. Okay, there we go. Can everyone see the presentation at this point? Not at like this very point, but when I just started going back over it again, was that visible? Again, I'm very sorry about that. I thought I had set the screen. It's possible that either I didn't or something went wrong. Hopefully it wasn't that something went wrong and it was just my mistake. Is everyone able to see the screen that I am? Okay, great. Good. Okay, yeah, so back to Grover Krantz. So he's an anthropologist who becomes prominent in the 1970s, working at University of Minnesota. Very respected, unfortunately, up until he begins to talk about the Sasquatch. And he was a very big proponent of Sasquatch research. And he himself is the person who essentially came up with Gigantopithecus, Sasquatch connection. Talked about, the possibility of Gigantopithecus being bipedal, and, built this skull reconstruction based off of both Gigantopithecus anatomy that we knew about and Sasquatch sightings, and of course proposing the Gigantopithecus canadensis species to a Canadian science board, which was rejected. And he talks about the Bering Land Bridge, the omnivorous nature of Gigantopithecus teeth, the fact that Gigantopithecus is such a close size comparison, the fact that even Patty has these hominid features such as the low set head on the shoulders and things like that, which we see in gorillas. One thing I forgot to mention about Grover Krantz that many of you may find interesting, you can actually go and see Grover Krantz's actual skeleton at the Smithsonian Museum, and his dog as well. A rather strange circumstance, but certainly very interesting. So technically, you can still go see Grover Krantz, which would be an adventure in itself, I'm sure. We have the big, debate over whether or not Gigantopithecus should be considered an Asian human ancestor or an Asian ape, non-human ape, obviously, since humans are technically apes. And if that was a big debate in the era over whether or not humans came out of Africa or Asia. Eventually, we settle on Africa because we find the oldest fossils in Africa, although sometimes we do find species that are a bit of an anomaly considering that. And, that kind of built, to that point, the idea of this big bipedal Gigantopithecus. We eventually find more data, such as the size of the mandible, and the protein analysis of the makeup of the bones, that these are actually closer to things like orangutans and belong mostly to the family Ponginae, which is essentially the Asian apes, we'll say. So that leads us to, unfortunately for many of us, because this would be really an incredible animal to find in our fossil record, we're looking at something more like this, which is still very incredible. And again, please go check out Ramon Lopez on Quagga if you can. Really, really great artist. Wonderful. And here's our little comparison of a bipedal versus quadrupedal Gigantopithecus. Again, so sorry for the mishap with the screen there. Does anyone have any questions about the Gigantopithecus theory? I'm trying to see if we have any right now. We have some cool Mothman-oriented discussion, it seems. Ohio Howl, look at that. I grew up a mile from the spot of the Ohio Howl. That's a very well-known piece of Bigfoot audio, so that's really interesting. Got someone saying Karac is very wise. Thank you very much. Apparently I'm not as tech-savvy as I am wise. Luckily we have that going again, though. Good. Everything is looking great. When did Giganto go extinct? That's a great question. Obviously, that's kind of a big debate as well. Essentially, we're looking at maybe around 125,000 years ago. So chances are, humans did interact with Gigantopithecus, which is a really interesting concept for sure. There's some art on that didn't make it into the presentation, but it's very cool stuff. And it makes you think about wild man stories, because that isn't all that long ago. Granted, humans are pretty recent on the scene of evolution, but it isn't all that long ago, 125,000 years ago. Artistic language existed more than 125,000 years ago. So who knows? Maybe one day we'll find artistic representations of Gigantopithecus. But until then, we're forced to assume that there's no linguistic record of Giganto, and we had to rediscover it, essentially. All right, so hopefully that was comprehensive enough. We'll move on to our second alleged candidate here, which is kind of one of my personal favorites, Dryopithecus, which is another extinct fossil ape. I'm paranoid. Let me just make sure this is... there we go. Okay. What was that? All right. So Dryopithecus / Dryopithecus Descendant. Again, a lot of this is, the similarities fall short a bit. So when we talk about ancient animals in the modern age, we have to assume there's been some changes. So it looks like I've accidentally actually kept this here, which I should not have done. Look at me all unprepared here. It is not found by Ralph von Koningswald. It is found by a French paleontologist named Edard Latet in 1856. It's found in Europe, which is actually really interesting because we do not have many European apes on record whatsoever. And the climate it lives in is quite interesting too. Its name means the oak ape because it lived in wooded areas that were not tropical. So, really, really unique in the fossil record. There's also, like with Gigantopithecus, a lot of debate around multiple subspecies of Dryopithecus, and funny enough, for the same reasons. We find varying sizes of molars, of partial skulls, and we don't know if that's sexual dimorphism or if that's different species. There's been, I think, at least 5 different subspecies of Dryopithecus, proposed, but the only one that's really recognized is Dryopithecus fontani. And there's conflicting information that I've been able to find, at least, on when exactly Dryopithecus existed. One source says 20 to 30 million years ago, and one says about 12 to 11 million years ago. So I'm assuming what we're looking at is probably the range of Dryopithecus relatives as they transitioned into and then maybe transitioned away from true Dryopithecus. And funny enough, some of the best insight that we have as to why Dryopithecus is such a special case in the fossil record comes from Charles Darwin. Here's a quote from him. "It is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere. But it is useless to speculate on this subject. For 2 or 3 anthropomorphous apes, one, the Dryopithecus of Lartet, nearly as large as a man and closely allied to Hylobates, existed in Europe during the Miocene age, and since so remote a period, the Earth has certainly undergone many great revolutions, and there has been ample time for migration on the largest scale." It's so interesting because talking about migration from, Europe to North America, Darwin had no idea that he, in some sense, was accidentally arguing for the case of modern Dryopithecus, or at least modern Dryopithecus descendants. So, and, here's another interesting thing. Look closely here. Nearly as large as a man. So that is one feature of Dryopithecus that really was interesting, is that towards the end of its evolutionary lineage in the fossil record, it became much more man-like. And that might be represented by these different, these conflicting fossils that we're seeing. But someone who's really highlighted that particular problem quite well is a YouTuber who goes by the name Bob Gimlin. And no, not the the Patterson Gimlin Bob Gimlin. I'm sure many of you know the Bob Gimlin channel. It really is fantastic, and I recommend it highly. And he makes the argument in one of his earliest videos that's on Dryopithecus for essentially what you might call one of the most human apes that we have in the fossil record. the size range from when we start to see Dryopithecus fossils to the end of when we see Dryopithecus fossils is something like from a lemur to a chimp. Bob even highlights that really it's kind of like a big chimp, something between a chimp and a mountain gorilla. There's some speculation on Dryopithecus arm length, but the evidence that we have so far very lightly suggests that perhaps they had an arm span, so, as they held out their arms, that was only slightly longer than their height, which not only indicates a change in size of the body, but also potentially a move towards bipedalism and away from knuckle walking. And of course, in one of his videos, Bob Gimlin remarks that this sounds familiar, and of course, by familiar he means similar to descriptions of the Sasquatch. So, and here's an artistic representation of Dryopithecus. And, looking at it, if you were to imagine it getting larger, growing a more conical head, its nose becoming hooded, and it going the proportions that it was going towards, like Charles Darwin said, it isn't hard to imagine that this change could have occurred and that migration could have occurred. Of course, we have no direct fossil evidence for this, but throughout all of this, it's very important to note. Fossils of primates are exceedingly difficult to find, not just because they're fossils, but because most primates, aside from people, live in almost exclusively tropical acidic environments, so the bones get eaten rather quickly. So again, much like Gigantopithecus, it falls short on many features. It fits geographically. It's a unique thing in our fossil record, and it had plenty of room for development and was really kind of almost going the Bigfoot direction by the time that it, as far as we know, went extinct. Unfortunately, a lot of this being pulled from minute fossil records, as much as you can pull from those, because it's actually quite a lot, we are forced to speculate to some extent, and of course that leads to nothing definitive. Not just yet, anyway. Now, before I go on to this one, does anyone have any questions about Dryopithecus? Let me see. Oh, we have someone from Nottingham, England coming in. Hello, Ashley. Good to see you. See, the bit of the patty creature didn't look like the sort of thing that would look comfortable on all fours. Do you mean the representation with the bit of the patty creature? Oh, do you mean the actual Patterson-Gimlin subject itself? If so, then yeah, I would say that it would be difficult to imagine something like that on all fours. It doesn't mean, I suppose, that if there are Sasquatches, they don't go down on all fours. There is actually some... Yeah, thank you for confirming, Mothman 46. Yeah, there is some, there's a lot of sightings and there's some interesting footage, but it's hard to tell because we don't know that much if these things do exist. And the anatomy doesn't seem like it would fit that, but what do you do when you have anatomy that you just simply don't know much about? It's a bit difficult to discern what's likely and what's not when talking about the unknown, obviously. You bring up a good point, though. It really, highlights how little we truly do know about what's going on, if anything real is going on. All right, so if no one has any other questions, I will continue. Oh, here's a cool one. We have the Hairy Man Road down here in Texas, sightings going back to 1800s. That is really, really interesting. I would love to hear more about that. All right. Okay, so here we have a somewhat more controversial issue, and this is one reason that I'm not putting any of my opinions in this. This is an analysis of points, essentially. This is the primate hybrid theory. And there's actually quite a lot of primate hybrid theories, everything from South American giant sloths, you name it, essentially. But this particular one got the most popular after a geneticist named Melba Ketchum supposedly, with her team, sequenced what she believed was a partial genome of the Sasquatch. And there's some questions about this. Beforehand, we should be introduced to this fellow right here, which is called Megalatopithecus, or it's a strange one, Megalatopus. I'll remember that. Megalatopus is really, for one thing, a very strange-looking animal. It's actually a sloth-like lemur, a giant lemur that existed in the fossil record only until about 300 to 500 years ago in Madagascar. People mainly knew it from writings of travelers. As far as we know, there aren't that many artistic representations from the time period of this animal. It's basically just in writings, and of course, it being so far back, there are unfortunately no photographs and no videos of this animal. We know it existed, but unfortunately, we weren't there to properly catalog that it was there. And this is important to note. This is a species of giant lemur. As strange as it looks, this itself is a lemur. And lemurs developed on Madagascar pretty exclusively, and they developed there a pretty long time ago. So, we're looking at here, we're talking the break-off happening around at least 54 million years ago, when the same family as bush babies broke off and became isolated on Madagascar. And of course, this happens during continental drift when, the island splits apart as a landmass. So what does this have to do with hybrids? Well, hybrids are interesting because you have animals that are, excuse me for moving my camera there, you have animals that are similar enough to create offspring, but they don't necessarily have to be the same species. And this is the offspring of what we call a hybrid. So for example, a horse and a donkey are similar enough that they can mate to create a mule, which is a hybrid of horse and donkey. You also have hybrids of donkeys and zebras. You have hybrids of lions and tigers. And, one thing you'll find is that one of the main factors in whether or not a hybrid offspring can be produced between two species is there needs to be a certain level of anatomical similarity. And, this even this is kind of far, but it works apparently. And, lions and tigers are quite similar as well, and lions and jaguars are able to do this too. There's a wide degree of things that you can do with hybrids, but there's a parameter. There's a point where two species just become too dissimilar to be able to mate properly. And that's where this guy comes in. One interpretation, because there are many, but as far as I know, this is the most accurate interpretation of what Melba Ketchum, again, this geneticist, and her lab stated in a paper was that the genome that had been partially sequenced, which essentially is a string of DNA, showed to be what was called a human hybrid. Unfortunately, in a lot of interviews, that is not elaborated on. The only title given is human hybrid, which really isn't a very informative title, unfortunately, because we're all human hybrids. Many of us have Neanderthal DNA, for example. We're not true Homo sapiens. So many of us are human hybrids. It's a very it's an unfortunately vague term. But what was meant, according to the paper, was that at somewhere around 15,000 years ago, proposed by the paper, a species of giant lemur, possibly this species, because this was our most recent one, a male of that species particularly, and a human female mated to create a species that would go on to foster the Sasquatch. Now, there's two problems with this. One is that the species are so dissimilar that this is likely impossible. There's just too many genetic differences. And even if there were enough to produce offspring miraculously, there's a massive glaring problem with hybrid offspring. It's a rule that is essentially never broken unless we're talking about terms of, exceedingly close crossbreeding that fosters evolution. And it has to be so close that they're nearly the same species. Hybrid offspring themselves are infertile. They cannot produce offspring with any other animal. A mule can't even produce a mule with another mule. It doesn't work. So, unfortunately, the offspring of this animal and an ancient or modern human, even if it could happen, simply likely wouldn't be able to reproduce. They're just too different, as you can see here. This is, roughly speaking, the same kind of animal. It's a lemur skeleton compared to an ancient lemur, and it really is just too dissimilar. There's no reason zoologically to believe that there would be an exception to the rule with two species that are so incredibly different. Unfortunately, there is also a certain amount of secrecy and a consistent vagueness that did go with the Melba Ketchum findings. I mean to say nothing about Melba Ketchum herself or her team, but there was a great degree of vagueness, and that fostered a lot of misunderstanding and continues to do so, and might even suggest that the paper itself is flawed. So that's kind of where that part settles. And I'll actually look to the chat again to see if we have... Oh my gosh. I am so sorry. I can't believe that I keep doing this. There is something very strange going on here. Okay. Oh, that's so embarrassing. I'm very sorry about that. Well, luckily that's a short section, so we'll go right through it again. I'm going to check that more often. So here we have the first slide talking about this, introducing Melpoketchum, the genome sequence, and calling into question some of the consistency of what the findings said. Here we have Megalodopithecus. It is the giant lemur we were talking about. Again, very recent species, known mostly from ancient writings because we don't have many artistic representations, even though it was quite recent. We do have, I believe we do have some bone remains, but unfortunately we've never been able to, photograph a live specimen existing so long ago. And here's our chart discussing the genetic drift that occurs at some point, roughly 60 to 50 million years ago, at the very least, from the group that fostered lorises and the bush babies to lemurs as the continental drift created Madagascar. And here we have our slide talking about the fact that horses and donkeys can reproduce to create mules, and the suggestion by Melba Ketchum's paper that a similar thing occurred to where the Sasquatch was fostered by the intercourse happening between a prehistoric lemur and a modern or ancient human. And, to cover it again, it's just very unlikely because the two species are very, very different. And even if an offspring could be produced, much like mules, ligers, what have you, it would not be able to reproduce. Again, these kinds of things these hybrids are only able to reproduce when they are so similar that they almost might as well be the same species. And that's one route by which evolution takes place, because we have a tiny bit of crossbreeding that happens. So, for instance, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, essentially robustness and cranium size was the difference, and that was about it. So that was enough for us to have fertile offspring. Again, for example, and looking at this skeleton of a modern lemur, which is, again, very similar to a prehistoric, well, not even prehistoric, just an ancient lemur that we have here, it's simply too different to have properly mingled. And the vagueness of the study itself is unfortunately part of what calls all these findings into question. This is nothing of a personal note or anything like that. It's just an unfortunately written paper, and hopefully at some point in the future, if the findings are indeed significant, they can be clarified a bit better than they had been before. Okay, so again, very sorry about the presentation slides. Let's see. What do we have here? Here's one. What about gorilla with acromegaly? If it could happen to us, it could happen to apes. I don't know, actually, that particular species, Makan. I would love to know what acromegaly is exactly. Let's see. Here we have one that we'll actually go over a little bit later. Sean Fry says, I think they are descendants of Homo heidelbergensis. You are certainly not alone in that thought process. There's a lot of suggestion that ancient human and prehistoric human that are all kind of intermingled in the Homo, the Australopithecines are fair candidates, and we'll definitely go over that towards the end of the presentation. I appreciate that comment right there. I'll make sure to do better about this. Peggy Curtis says, I'd like a megalodopus for a pet. So cute. It is a rather, it's a cute little guy for sure. A cute big guy, I guess. But yeah, they're, they are just such fascinating. When I first saw that, I was so fascinated by that because just the thought of a massive lemur is so, it really is almost entertaining in that way. So yeah, so, we have, oh, I see. Interesting. Sorry, my bad. That is a giant disease then. Yeah, I suppose that if you had it would have to be a mutation and not a disease necessarily. Although I suppose that is what Andre had. The problem that exists with that sometimes is that in humans that tends to shorten lifespan. But I don't know if we know exactly how well that would fare in other primates. So perhaps if you did have let's say an ancient species of ape that developed some kind of gigantism as a mutation, if that happened to aid it, it could absolutely pass that down to offspring. And that's probably how we get things like, that is how we get things like Gigantopithecus. So definitely a good notion there. All right. Southern Grit said this is very interesting. I'm glad that you're liking it. Seriously, I'm very glad. Okay, there we go. See, I can share my screen. So really quickly, I'm actually going to make sure that this laptop is charged properly because I don't want it to die during the presentation. So I will actually momentarily be off screen, just making sure that this is plugged in properly. And there we go. All right, that should do it. All right, so let's get back into the presentation. Making sure everyone, yep, I am showing that this time for sure. Great, great, great. So that brings us into a very small chapter of the presentation. Really, not a passing point necessarily, but a relatively small one, which is the unknown ape hypothesis, which is one of my personal favorites, and essentially just states, well, we have plenty of things that are similar to Sasquatch in the fossil record, but nothing that matches exactly precisely. So perhaps what we're looking at is related to some of those, perhaps closely, but is itself a new kind of primate and not something that we've seen necessarily. And, I think that's a very interesting notion because, that is the crux that I hope I should say that this presentation highlights, is that we have a lot of similar to Sasquatch candidates, but not a perfect Sasquatch candidate. There are some that are very close to it, but fall short on maybe one or two things. And because of that, I think it's important, this is kind of why we highlight evolution a lot. Things develop over time. So let's say you had Gigantopithecus and Sasquatch was, let's say the Gigantopithecus theory was correct. My apologies for stuttering a lot tonight. Let's say the Gigantopithecus hypothesis was correct, just hypothetically. We would have to assume that there is, in fact, a difference between the Sasquatch and what we might call a true Gigantopithecus. And maybe even there's enough differences to say that they're not the same animal, one just came from the other one. It's a bit like when we talk about how theropods, the smaller ones, developed into today's birds. We wouldn't, aside from kind of half-jokingly, call a bird a dinosaur. They're very similar to theropods, and they keep a lot of theropod features, but, clearly they're not the same animal. They're just very similar animals. So, not to say that that isn't significant, it absolutely is. The relationships between animals evolutionary is very crucial to understanding those animals, but there's also the distinction that one must not conflate the two with each other if one is to portray the state of that animal zoologically accurately. So the unknown ape hypothesis essentially states perhaps these things come from ancient primates or maybe even modern primates. I highlighted in my last presentation that they had, if they do exist, their behavior matches very closely with chimpanzee behavior. There's some studies suggesting a pangenus origin. So perhaps it's developed from chimpanzees. Perhaps it's developed from Giganto. Perhaps it's developed from Dryopithecus. Perhaps it's developed from humans. But it isn't exactly the species being proposed for any of those. And I think that that's a rather abstract, perhaps even vague, but a very interesting argument. So before we move on into the hominins, because that's essentially it for the hominids, does anyone have any questions about that? Here's one. Oh, excuse me. I should probably drink some water, shouldn't I? Here's one that we'll be getting to, actually. That could be Zana, the Russian wild woman. So, yeah, we actually talk a bit about Zana near the end of this presentation. Zana, Zana's a very interesting case because we have genetic analysis of what Zana's offspring were. So we know that Zana probably did exist. Whether or not she was not a modern human, not even a human, is obviously very up for debate. But she probably existed. So, that makes her a very interesting case for sure. For those of you who are unaware, Zana was allegedly a we'll say, Russian Bigfoot-like individual who was captured by a village, I believe in the 19 or 1800s, which is a long span of time, my apologies. And was held captive and kind of adjusted to life there, was able to do chores and such, actually mated with one of the men in the village and had offspring named, I think, Kit, I think was the name. And Kit actually did, he was a real person. And there is genetic analysis on his bones and such. And, whether or not Zana's considered as part of the Sasquatch mystery is itself in a debate. So for sure, that would be an interesting case to look into in terms of the origins of the Sasquatch. Let's see. Have you heard of the Ochisi pond wildman, captured in Panhandle of Florida and kept at Chattahoochee Hospital? Zana's son's pics are interesting. Her first 2 babies died dipping in river. Yes, I understand that was part of the story of Zana. Was her first 2 offspring did not survive, but not because of genetic issues. I have not heard that story, actually. I should look that up when I get the chance to here. Leonidas says, regarding Pleiades DNA research, wouldn't it make more sense to be closely related to humans than the great apes? If the DNA results are real, of course. I understand not enough about the Pleiades findings to fully make a statement on that. My best, what would you say? My best answer to that kind of question, I think, would be something like, well, perhaps it is still difficult in that situation to tell what's hominid and hominin. But if it does exist, for one thing, and if it is human, well, really, I think in a way that almost highlights the same point, because if it is human, had a lot of us going as ape, that's for sure, fooled a lot of us. So we're going to be talking about ancient humans that resemble apes so closely that you would almost not be able to tell the difference. And I think that's why chimps and bonobos get lumped sometimes into hominin as well by scientists, because we're just so similar. Here we go. Another story about Zana right here. Zana was 6'6", covered in fur, and could outride a horse. Yep, that was one of the most popular descriptions of her from the text that she was represented in. Some good documentaries on it. 2-egg TV did a 3-part series on Ochisi, Pond Wildman. Definitely look into it and keep up the great work, my friend. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right. Let's get back into this presentation so we can all talk about Zana soon here, because it seems we are all absolutely dying for more of Zana information. So here we go into the hominin. So again, we have to kind of ask here, just making sure that I'm sharing, why would we consider the hominins, especially having outlined how similar the great apes that we know of, and not just the existing ones, but the pre-existing ones, are to Sasquatch reports? Why even consider hominin? And the answer is that, well, the anatomy is so close to a person. Bipedal is in about 99.9% of reports. That is essentially 99.9% of the way to considering something a hominin. We would just need to know where it lies evolutionarily. There are many displays of behavior that suggest cognitive patterns of behavior. So something that maybe doesn't use tools, but is as intelligent as a tool user, or as cognitive, I should say, which there's a line between that and intelligence. And the question is, where does one draw that line? Where do you draw the line, not just in anatomy, but in evolution and in the cognitive behavior of a creature from human to not human, or rather, in this case, from not human to human? So one of the biggest existing things that we have in the fossil record that for a while was kind of a contending point with this are the Australopithecines, specifically the Paranthropus. And there are several subspecies of Paranthropus, subgenuses, sorry. But they themselves are an offshoot of the Australopithecines. They themselves actually are still considered Australopithecines, but are of their own group. They're the most similar of the ancient humans to Sasquatch that we know of. They match Patty very well, and they display many, many, many Sasquatch-like traits in their anatomy, but differences do exist. Here we have a reconstruction of the type genus, which is essentially the flagship genus for Paranthropus because there are other variations of Paranthropus, but this is kind of, when you think of a Paranthropus, this is what you should be thinking of, sort of thing. Paranthropus robustus existed between 2 to 1 million years ago. It's one of the first ancient hominin that we ever discover. And as you can tell, it exists pretty early on in human lineage because it really is just so incredibly ape-like. And, this highlights the problem that we encounter. How is this not a non-human ape? It has just enough human features, this is the answer, to be considered a human. And then you look at a chimpanzee and you think, well, really, what's the difference? I don't have the answer. I'm simply posing the question there. So, of course, this is also an African human ancestor here, discovered in 1938. And as you can see, it has this very square, muscular build in both the body and the face. And really, just looking at it like this, if you made, 1 or 2 changes, even that might be a bit drastic. We're looking at a Sasquatch here. Maybe not a true Sasquatch, but we're looking at what people describe when they see a Sasquatch much of the time. Maybe wider shoulders, more of a sagittal crest. What better representation, aside from thick fur, could you really ask for? But that's one of the issues that we have. Here, before we read this quote, we'll actually highlight the differences very quickly. Here's a reconstruction of what a female Paranthropus robustus probably looked like compared with fossils. Sorry, based off fossils. We have a slope in the head, but not necessarily to the extreme nature that we see in Sasquatch sightings, although the shape of the skull roughly does still fit the what kind of musculature we might expect to find up there. The hair is one problem. We do have this hair-covered human ancestor, and of course, it's hard to tell how much hair something had based off of fossils, but if this is anywhere near accurate, we need something with much, much more hair to accurately represent the really kind of shaggy, matted nature of Sasquatch hair or fur that we get reported. So, we have a few contending factors there. And of course, the height's a problem. These are animals, they are animals, but these were human ancestors, I should say, that grew to only about 4 to 5 feet tall, 1.2 to 1.5 meters tall. Whereas the Sasquatch, we're talking something that is upwards of, 2 to 3 meters in height. A much bigger specimen than the common Paranthropus robustus would have been. So here we actually have a very interesting connection between Paranthropus and Gigantopithecus, and we actually mentioned a bit of that at the beginning of our presentation here. So let's read a bit on this. In 1939, Robert Broom hypothesized that Paranthropus robustus was closely related to the similarly large-toothed ape Gigantopithecus from Asia, believing Gigantopithecus to have been a hominin, again, of the human group, specifically. Primarily influenced by the mid-century opinions of Jewish-German anthropologist Franz Reidenreich and German-Dutch paleontologist Ralph von Koenigswald, that Gigantopithecus was, respectively, the direct ancestor of the Asian Homo erectus, or closely related, much debate followed over whether Gigantopithecus was a hominin or a non-human ape, aka a hominid. In 1972, Robinson suggested including Gigantopithecus in the Paranthropinae, which is essentially the group Paranthropus, as part of the G. Belasparensis, which is essentially what eventually became Indopithecus and is now partially recognized, mostly I should say recognized as Gigantopithecus giganteus, as the ancestor of Paranthropus and the Chinese Gigantopithecus blacki, suggesting that there was some convergence there. He also believes that they both had a massive build. In contrast, he reported a very small build for Homo africanus, which is actually now called Australopithecus africanus, and speculated at some cultural and hunting abilities, being a member of the human lineage, which was something that he believed Paranthropines lacked. So there's something interesting there. For one thing, we have this distinction with Gigantopithecus actually being in Panganae instead of in Hominae, but we also have what are now outdated notions of what Paranthropus was. We know now that Paranthropus was, in fact, not just being a member of the human lineage, but was actually one of the main groups of the Australopithecines, which Africanus was part of. So we have the convergence of the ideas there, funny enough, but they were outdated, and we now know them to be false. So unfortunately for many of us, because it would be so fun to have this be the case, this and the Gigantopithecus are not directly related. So again, we have these differences. And despite these differences, we have this unfortunately very low quality zoomed in frame of the Patterson-Gimlin subject from the side. And this is a notion that Jeff Meldrum has echoed in many of his presentations recently on just the really what I would say is fair to say are really stunning similarities between the shape of the Patterson-Gimlin face, the shape of the skull, the shape of the head, which again matches a lot of Sasquatch reports, and the skull of Paranthropus robustus. So we can kind of see here, we have the eyes a little bit lower is what they would need to be. The chin is a little bit off. The mouth lines up right well. The top of the head is roughly where it would need to be. The trapezius can obviously explain the lack of the indent near the back of the head. The eyebrows, eye ridge almost perfectly lines up. So we do have some very strong similarity. Again, there's a few features that are off, but out of all the candidates, especially within the hominin candidates specifically, this is one of the closest. So before we get into one of our last little pieces here, let's take a look at what everyone here thinks about all of the talk of Australopithecines. Let's see. Yes, here is one thing that is very interesting. Look at the Aussie Aboriginal people's difference in appearance to African to American, and you will see evolutional difference. Absolutely. We actually see that a lot in athletics as well. So one thing that you'll notice is that most of the world's best sprinters and runners are African descent, whereas most of the best lifters are of European descent. And as far as we can tell, the reason for this is actually evolutionary. The human populations that led to African lineages, direct African lineages, I should say, although technically I guess we're all direct African lineages, but the closest ones had to adapt for running because of the environment. There was the hunting required the need to run because of flat terrain, essentially. Whereas up north in European areas, people descended from Neanderthals, let's say, more directly, required a lot of heavy lifting, a lot more, building of structures and things like that. There had to be, more, less leg-oriented activity, essentially. So lifting objects was an important factor. So yeah, that's one thing that we have to kind of mention when talking about variations of humans, is that we have a wide variety of variations. Even today, muscle structure with things like lifting and running are apparent in the data. So we're all Homo sapien, roughly speaking, mostly at least, because a lot of us, and most of us, I would say, have Neanderthal DNA to at least some extent. But the variations are just so minute, but they mean so much. Just the small variations in muscle structure that we're seeing already result in champions mostly falling into those different ethnic categories, who, when talking about actual different speciation of humans, we have a very wide variety. And that's kind of one reason why we won't go over all of it, just because there's so much to go over with this kind of thing. It really is incredible how many humans there have been. I think that's one thing that is so fun about this presentation, for me making it, and hopefully for everyone watching it, is that there is such a fun aspect to just looking at how many things that could be considered human have existed. And, everyone talks, when mentioning this, about what makes a species human, what makes us human. I don't think there's a clear answer, and personally, I would call into question of whether or not there will be a clear answer, because we find new things all the time. And again, back to Dragon Man there, we find new things all the time. And the more we find, the more it seems like the gap between hominin and hominid is kind of, it's getting very, very minute, that gap. So that is one reason for all the debate, essentially, right? That's one of the reasons that we have so much of the debate about what Sasquatch would be. Hominid versus hominin, well, where do you draw the line? And do we suggest species that we know existing because it makes it easier? Or are we saying that they're similar, like Paranthropus? When someone suggests Paranthropus, are we saying close to Paranthropus, or are we saying directly Paranthropus? Because there are some differences. And, it's just so hard to tell. The fact that some scientists include the pangenus, like chimpanzees and bonobos, in hominin really is, again, exemplary of just even scientists looking at the data and saying, we don't know what to consider human at some point. Not because we don't know enough. Well, everything that we're not sure of is because we don't know enough, because we're human, and it's hard to observe things that happened millions of years ago. It's a miracle we can in the first place, really. But it's just so hard to make distinctions like that. And if anything, coming away from this presentation, I hope that everyone comes off with kind of a concept of how difficult that can be. Because, really, as Peggy Karac is saying right here, it's a really thought-inducing concept for sure. And thank you, Peggy. All right, we're moving on to, I believe, our last section here, essentially. So let's share this screen, and let's get right into this. All right, so this is a rather short one for hominin, the Neanderthals. Now, there's kind of, in a way, 2 or 3 classifications of what you might call wild man sightings. There's Bigfoot types, there's more ape-like than that, and then there's human-like, very human-like. We're talking like it looked like a naked person almost, sort of thing, but with, ape-like features. And that is essentially where the Neanderthal hypothesis comes in. The suggestion that wild men and Sasquatch sightings are Neanderthals. And they may explain stranger encounters where interactions a bit more layered than the typical interaction between alleged Sasquatch and people. These are people, Neanderthals, very closely related to Homo sapiens. Not maybe in terms of evolution, because we're not descended, well, at the time we weren't descended from them, but we were very similar. They exist around 430 or 50,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago. And they are basically the flagship European hominin. They did the best in terms of the cold European environment for the human species, of course, aside from us. Now, of course, here's the big issue. Here is our most recent accurate representations based on the evidence that we have for what Neanderthals looked like. And the first thing you'll notice is that in terms of something like the Patterson-Gimlin film, there really is no accurate comparison aside from if you stripped all the hair off of the Patterson-Gimlin subject, or off of any Bigfoot subject for that matter. So things like ape-like Bigfoot sightings, even with this hairy guy over here, it really does not cut it. That being said, that doesn't mean that there aren't cases in which it does cut it. And we'll talk about that in a second, because first there's a bit of a rumor to be dispelled. There is still we'll say, a relatively becoming fringe idea that, and this used to be an old idea before we found evidence for the otherwise, that Neanderthals were kind of these very violent killer apes that were covered in hair. Now, a lot of that could be true. Obviously, to compete with other people, you need to be vicious. So the vicious aspect maybe is not universal, but, as hunters and as people who had to contend with other people for sheer survival, let alone for resources for other things, being vicious is a part of every human species, I would imagine. But it being covered in hair is a problem. The main reason this is still suggested is because, in a cold European environment, you would need to adapt hair. That makes the most sense. The problem being is that throughout the timeline of Neanderthals existing, one of the constants that we find is tools. They were tool users, and one of the tools that we find that they used were these fur and leatherwork tools. The markings that we find on these tools are directly meant for working fur and leather, aka making clothes for warmth. So, the problem we're then running into. Oh, I hope this is there we go. Hope everyone can uh, can hear me well. All right, I have returned here. Hopefully, uh, not everyone. Ah, man. Hopefully, not everyone left that. Can everyone see me properly here? Hoping everyone can still tune in here. We're almost done here. The last leg. Okay, great, good. People can still see. Wonderful. We didn't lose too many people, it seems. All right, so let me go back to where I was. Again, I'm so sorry about that. My computer actually crashed. It appears we're having technical problems absolutely everywhere tonight, but we as cryptozoologists are nothing if not persistent. So let's pull up this presentation again. In the meantime, does anyone have any questions before we kind of begin to end off the presentation here? I would love to know people's thoughts on what we have going so far. Let's see. Here we go. There, yes. Great. Very glad to see everyone's still here. Awesome. Okay, here's one interesting question, actually. Weren't some Neanderthals found in parts of Asia as well? Yes, we do have the drift geographically there of Neanderthals, essentially coming out of Africa up through the line between Europe and Asia, and then spreading into both Europe and Asia, but mainly into Europe is where we have our largest and most significant populations. Here we go. Apes and chimps use simple tools. Yes, chimps have been observed making spears. So, and even lesser monkeys use rocks to break open certain food items that need to be broken open to access them. So is that a Stone Age? It's a very good question there. All right, let's see. Let's pull up the apparently cursed presentation that we have going on here. And let's finish this job. Peggy Harris, one day I hope I'll be well-versed enough to ask intelligent questions on this subject. Any question is a good question. There are absolutely no bad questions. You don't need to ask what you might perceive as an intelligent question, I would argue, because if you had to be well-versed to ask a question, I don't think anyone would be well-versed. So, no shame in any kind of question there, Peggy. No shame at all. Let's see. All right. Presentation is almost loaded back up here. Let's just get back to where we were in it. Again, we're right at that finish line there. Funny enough, we were just about to jump into Zana a little bit. So without further ado, let me share my screen here. Okay, here we go. So we left off with this slide, which is in case we happen to have an error there, talking about these tools that are found throughout a lot of Neanderthal sites across the persistence of Neanderthals through time. And what we see essentially in these tools are the markings that indicate that they were used in working leather and furs. So these are cloth-making tools. These were used for making clothes, which would be useless if you were covered in hair, obviously. And it's not just leather they're making, maybe, primitive armor or whatever. They're making fur. So we have a species that does need to wear something to stay warm, essentially. And if you were, ape-like and covered in hair, you wouldn't really need clothes necessarily. So this is the evidence essentially that we have, and it's quite persistent evidence that we're not looking at a species that looked like this, but more so a species that looked like this. And again, not very Sasquatch-like. However, it is similar to things like the Almasti, which is the Russian variation, essentially, of the Bigfoot story, of the wild man. And the most famous Almaz story is the story of Zana. Again, in the, I believe the 1900s, 1800s, late 1800s perhaps, Zana was supposedly found outside the village and was kidnapped and captured and taken into the village, where she was essentially raised as a working civilian there, you could say. Learned to do, basic simple tasks, could carry boxes supposedly, and she was described as a 6'6" hairy wild woman. But looking at her, there's differences between what Zana looks like and what, let's say, a traditional Sasquatch looks like. The hair isn't as thick; it's just kind of a hairy body, but humanoid hairy, and longer hair on the head, very Neanderthal-like. And of course, Zana's son Kit, who is the surviving of her offspring, supposedly did have some interesting DNA variation in his molars, I think it was. So, when talking about stories like Zana and what the Almas is usually described as, Neanderthal is kind of a very interesting prospect, especially given the region in which Neanderthals were mainly found in. There are two stories that really interest me particularly about Neanderthals. One was a study's the wrong word, but maybe a theory proposed recently on stories of trolls in the Norwegian countries, and that Neanderthals may have been a basis a long time ago for stories of trolls because of their robust size, their humanoid appearance, and their large, broad noses, which is often how kind of trolls are showed. So perhaps there's some interesting cultural origin, let's say, there. And I apologize as well, there's some fireworks outside. The other story that we find interesting, I think this is portrayed on the Ape Island episode of Monster Quest, if anyone would like to go watch that. There is a story from Vancouver Island, Canada, of someone seeing what they claim is a Sasquatch, but in description really sounds more like a Neanderthal or simply a wild person. So some very interesting overlap there, and making Neanderthal perhaps not a good candidate for Sasquatch particularly, but for, we'll say, some Sasquatch variations, some wild man variations from around the world. And that brings us to a very small last bit. This is a documentary that I recommend watching on this subject by Mountain Beast Mysteries over on YouTube. The supernatural side of Sasquatch. There are reports that are hard to explain. Reports from people who, well, it's hard to tell who's credible and who's not. You would otherwise say that these people are credible in most scenarios. So Ron Moorhead, the person who recorded the Sierra sounds when he was up in the Sierra camp with his friends in the 60s or 70s. I apologize if I had that wrong. Reported all sorts of paranormal and Fortean activity in the week leading up to the Sierra Sounds incident. And there are people who, one of my first podcasts was with Russell Ladmore, an Australian cryptozoologist who has a very, zoological approach to basically all of his research, and yet has had an encounter in which he claims to have seen what looked to be what he described as a yowie, he's Australian, run through a rock, not past it, but through it. This is not positing my own opinions on the supernatural side of things, or if supernatural is even an aspect in such reports. It's simply noting that I don't think that we should push this aside necessarily, because supernatural often ends up meaning things that we just don't understand yet, a mistranslation of what the reality is, let's say. And perhaps that's what we have going on. Many people would even argue that's what Bigfoot is, right, is a mistranslation of reality, that there's something zoological to be seen that many people interpret as, the big magical ape man in the woods, so to speak. Perhaps it's a phenomenon like that. And even then, there are some reports that are simply in conjunct with, in conjoined with other strange activity. So strange lights in the sky and Sasquatch, not even necessarily connected, but happening at the same time. These reports do seem to occur, if any of them occur, and they shouldn't necessarily be brushed aside. Just because they're strange doesn't mean that they're not potentially significant. And that's about all that I think can be anywhere near definitively said on this subject. But that would essentially here bring me to my last point, which is going to be a wonderful little short 6-minute talk from a wonderful podcast called the Bigfoot Society podcast. Highly recommend it, that Cliff Barrickman was on. And Cliff Barrickman had some very interesting things to say about his opinions on the origin of Sasquatch. And, right away he brings up some really cool points. So let's see what people are saying here. So here we have someone, those reports are not that hard to explain, probably all liar, trying to make a buck, Moorhead sells books. There are some cases where that happens for sure. I would say that most people trying to make a buck off Bigfoot, let's say, are either making little videos with suits or are, making very strange reports, let's say. Uh, hmm. I don't. I would say that there are some reports that people have had personal lives ruined over who have made no money or much popularity for that matter, really, that are just strange. And doesn't mean that they're necessarily true stories or that they were interpreted correctly. But I would check out Bob Gimlin's channel, and he has a few videos on reports like that really stand out in the database as not fitting the criteria for something of the sake of popularity. I would say check that out, because you bring up a very good point, Lockbeard, but I would also say that there's some variation to that too. Yep, Mothman says Samurai Chatter. Yes, that's the Ron Moorhead recording for the Sierra Sounds. Here we go. Roger Blair, didn't someone do a DNA test or talk about a DNA test on Zana's son, or should I say his remains? Seems like I've watched something about it. I think that was on Monster Quest 2, actually, Roger. I would check the Russia's Killer Ape episode, I think is what it's called. I never heard about the extra bone in his skull. That's interesting. Native Americans. Yeah, that was a really kind of big discussion point, because people knew what non-human primates were. By and large, they knew about smaller monkeys, but gorillas and chimpanzees, no. To them, the best they could say was big, hairy person, and that's where the word wild man comes from, essentially, aside from, the translations from Native American languages. So, yeah, let us wrap up this presentation here, shall we? Let me just make sure that I need to record audio for this. So let me share screen. Yep, share screen. All right, I'm going to want to share the audio here. Okay. So actually, you know what? I don't think I need to. So let's mute the screen audio. I will play a little bit of the audio and just let me know if you guys can hear it properly. So we're sharing. Let's present here. And again, I recommend The Supernatural Sasquatch. It's a good documentary. All right. Okay, no. So let's share the audio here. Present.
Sorry, I'm not a big word
Australopithecus?
Yeah, how'd you know?
You said Austral. There's not a lot of words to start.
Australia?
Yeah. No, yeah.
So, that.
Just want to make sure. Can everyone hear that properly? Let's just check to make sure very quickly. Can everyone hear that video, Rel? All right, great. So let's go back to this then. Uh-oh, nope, wrong slide. Let's break out of this. Don't want to say goodbye just yet here. All right, here we go. This is proper.
Sorry, I'm not a big word
Australopithecus?
Yeah, how'd you know?
You said Austral. There's not a lot of words to start.
Australia?
Yeah. No, yeah.
So, that or homo, or how would you classify? I guess is what the question.
Oh, well, see, we don't know enough. We just don't know enough. I personally favor the Paranthropus line.
Exactly.
Now, Paranthropus is one of the two main segments of the Australopithecines.
Mm-hmm.
Australopithecus is a genus that existed 4 to 2 million years ago, or actually less than that, million years ago. And they are what we think were one branch of that family, one branch of that genus eventually led to us. But the Australopithecines had two main branches. Gracile form, and gracile is an English word, of course. That means thinner and more slender, etc., and a more robust, thick sort of guy. And those were so different in so many ways that they actually gave them a different genus name, Paranthropus, even though they are Australopithecines. But the robust Australopithecines, the Paranthropocines, I think they're called, are basically Bigfoots. They're basically Bigfoots in every single way except their size. They're 4 to 5 feet tall, super robust. Like a 5-footer of those guys probably weighs 250 pounds or something. They're really, really thick animals. So if you had one of those that happened to live in the appropriate environment, a colder environment, in other words, because animals that live in colder regions get larger over time through generations. It's something called Bergman's rule, like Candace Bergman. She didn't write up that rule, but Bergman's rule.
Is that Murphy Brown?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, although we do have a Sasquatch named Murphy in the same building I'm in. And you can see the brown footage, of course, too.
What an amazing connection.
Yeah, there's actually 2 brown footages, both thermal, which is confusing. But anyway, so over time, the Bergman's rule would take over and make these Paranthropus larger, I believe, especially if they went northward out of Africa, into the Himalayas and further north into Siberia before crossing the land bridge. So I personally favor the Paranthropus hypothesis, which was, of course, I didn't make it up. I stand on the shoulders of giants. The first person to publish that was Gordon Strassenberg, who passed away in 2019, unfortunately. I'm kind of trying my best to get a hold of his family, but it's kind of a slow go. But anyway, I would love to see some of his notes, and if they have any research materials that still exist, and maybe do my best to preserve them with the museum here.
That'd be very cool.
Yeah. So anyway, I suspect that these things are Paranthropus, which is a type of Australopithecine. Now, which led to the genus Homo. So let's take another few steps back and let's call them hominids, not hominid, hominin. Hominid with a D at the end is a group that means human beings and the African apes. That's our family group. Those are our cousins. We're right there in them because we are an ape, essentially, at the end of the day. Now, we're a special ape. We're kind of weird. We do some stuff that other ones don't. That doesn't mean we're not biologically in their family, right? But hominin, with an N at the end, is a special term that means any human ancestor or offshoot of that line along the way. That is a hominin. So Neanderthals, even though we aren't directly related from Neanderthals, they're hominins because they're offshoots of our line. Australopithecines are hominins. So Sasquatches, I suspect, I don't know, are hominins. Now maybe they are Gigantopithecines. I don't know. Maybe they are more closely related to Gigantopithecus. But we know so very little about those. It's hard to say, man. It's really hard to say. And there's some physical differences that make me a little concerned, For example, we now know through proteomic studies, this past year, 2020, I believe, these studies were published, by studying the proteins that we have from Gigantopithecus. We know that they are in the line of orangutans. Okay, and we've always thought that anyway, based on the tooth structure. We've always thought that they were somewhere in the line between Shivapithecus. Now it's spelled S-I-V-A, but in the Sanskrit, it's pronounced more of an S-H. So it's a Shivapithecus down to orangutans. Now, Shivapithecus doesn't have a brow ridge. Orangutans don't have a brow ridge. Now, it's, of course, possible that Gigantopithecus developed a brow ridge, because Sasquatches are more or less uniformly described as having somewhat of a brow ridge.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I've talked to Meldrum about this, too. He goes, well, it could have arisen separately. Maybe it did. But we don't know, and that's my problem. We just don't know. Exactly. But we do know a fair amount about Paranthropus.
So to kind of, end off on, I think, a rather profound note there is what Cliff, I think, puts so eloquently there is we don't know. There's just we're talking about something that some would say is more than hypothetical, and some would say is definite, and some would say is certainly the opposite of definite. But either way, we're talking about origins that we unfortunately are forced to consider in the hypothetical because we don't have a time machine. We can't see that far back in person. We can't look that direction and say, aha, here we go, So we don't know enough. We don't know enough about the present animal, if it even exists, to speculate accurately enough on the origins of said animal. And that's kind of the whole point of this presentation, is to highlight some really interesting, cool factors, talk about some really cool prehistoric animals, but in the end to say, this appears to be unique if it exists. It doesn't mean that it's not a descendant of one of these things, but it clearly has changed if it is. And perhaps it changed so much that it's no longer a true one of those. And let's just kind of go back into the slide here really quickly, just so we can have a bit of a proper send-off here. Skip past the video, just to kind of show off the last slide one more time. I would like to thank everyone for getting through this particular presentation. We had some technical difficulties along the way here, but I hope that it was still enjoyable enough and that it was informative as well. That's my main hope with creating presentations like this, is that people can learn something, and hopefully the technical issues that we encountered, unfortunately, aren't something that deterred too much of that. And I sincerely apologize if it did. We have some talk about, I think, investigations going on right now. Yeah, look at that. Some conference talk. Lockbeard making a good point. I've been able to confirm mistaking animal identities many times happens quite often. Yes, it's especially with people who maybe are new to the countryside or something. It happens a lot. I saw someone comment about, two people actually comment about the Kandahar giant story, the red hair giant military encounter. I don't know much about that at all. I would ask Eli Watson when he's back in the next few weeks here, because he's also, I think, filming off somewhere. And, he would know more about that. He researches that quite frequently, as far as I know. So, oh, great. I'll let Alexander know that you guys gave him a super sticker there. Thank you very, very much, Peggy. Very appreciated. I'm sure Alexander will love that this happened. So here we go. Here's one interesting one. Based on my scientific knowledge and training, combined with all the evidence that I've reviewed that I've judged as possibly legit, it's my hypothesis that Sasquatch are a breed of Homo sapiens. I would love to have a rundown from you of exactly what convinces you of that. And I don't mean that in a challenging way either. I'm just genuinely curious. I'm glad that everyone seems to have enjoyed the presentation regardless of the issues that we encountered. If anyone else has any questions or any comments, please feel free to leave any. I'm open to taking some. I understand this has been going on for a little bit, but if anyone does have any, I'd love to take them. It gets me thinking so much about just the incredible element of nature that is change. That even if something isn't human, that could eventually be human. And that's just so interesting to me. And tree branches, family trees, says Green Mountain, cryptid research, genealogy. Absolutely. The speciation process is so interesting. And, when talking about something like Gigantopithecus, how much of a testament is it to the similarities between the hominids and the hominin that we, for decades, were looking at Gigantopithecus and thinking this thing might just be a human? How fascinating is that? We appear to not have any more comments or questions coming in, so I guess that will do it for the night. I'd like to thank everyone for bearing with me on this one and taking the time to watch and bear with the technical difficulties, and hopefully enjoy the presentation. I may be able to do a presentation next week or the week afterwards on the channel before Alexander comes back. So yeah, without babbling on too much here, thank you everyone for listening and watching it. It means a great deal to me. Hope you all enjoyed and have a very wonderful night, everyone. Take care.